Well, this is 2004, and we are confronting a very important election. Every 4 years, we have an election where, if anybody participates in voting, he or she generally does. They may skip the school boards, and they may skip the local elections, but if they choose to vote, they generally show up to vote for the president. And together with the president will be elections for the Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America, and there are governors who will be elected. But the main focus of this election is on the most powerful political position or job in the world, than which there is none more powerful. A job called the presidency of the United States of America, and the present incumbent is the man that we all know, George Bush Jr. And what is very interesting about the last 4 years is, in the history of presidencies, there has developed what I would call loves and hates. But certainly over the last 4 years, there has developed in this country, you can call it a psychological phenomenon, to be found among many, many people, a response to the President of the United States, which is, in its severity, quite distinct from previous ones. I call the condition, and you can go see a shrink about it. It's called Bushophobia. No, it's called Bushophobia. And Bushophobia means that whenever somebody says the word bush, I just saw a bush near your house. Oh! People become traumatized. Actually, the polarization of the public on this is fairly intense. And I'm trying to remember times in my childhood where people felt so negatively about a president. I grew up with a president. My next door neighbor went into mourning every time he was elected. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Bush Jr. also inspires very intense support from those people who think he is a great president, and very intense hatred and contempt. So this should be a very interesting election, because one of the great motivations of the Bush haters is to remove him under any circumstances, and to find a candidate who will be able to do it, who hopefully doesn't need shoulder surgery every few days. I mean, one of the motivations for choosing Kerry on the part of the Democrats basically was to choose a man they felt could defeat Bush. That is, the criterion became not is Kerry the best of all possible people but for the presidency, but who among the Democratic candidates or hopefuls would be able to defeat George Bush Jr. Well, the election is off and running. The campaign is off and running. You can tell that from the television ads, and you can tell it from the nasty statements made by both sides. And now we're focusing on the issues, because what the candidates, and I assume the candidates will be Bush and Kerry. I mean, it isn't confirmed until the conventions, you understand, but I assume it'll be Bush and Kerry. What both of them have to do is they have to mobilize their supporters. And above all, they have to direct their attention to the overwhelming majority of voters who don't see themselves as partisan Democrats or partisan Republicans. They may see themselves as vaguely Democratic or vaguely Republican or simply as independent. And they have to mobilize them, and the way they choose to mobilize them, either through their personalities, and there have been charismatic political personalities throughout history that just what? I mean, they walk on stage and they mumble. You don't even know what they mumble, right? But you vote for them. Or in the case of Bush and Kerry, it's going to have to be more than that. It's going to have to be addressing the issues. And that's what this series is about in this month of April, to somehow look at the issues. Over the last 4 years, since the election of 2000, lots of things have happened. The election of 2000 was, to say the least, a problematic election. There were many, many Democrats who were convinced that George Bush Jr. really wasn't the president of the United States of America, that Al Gore was. And finally, we settled down to accepting the fact that indeed George Bush Jr. was, and he then proceeded to lose the control of the Senate of the U.S. Congress. It wasn't very good. However, on September the 11th, 2001, his presidency was dramatically altered. He was turned from a faltering president into a war president, and initially he took on what we call a very strong persona. He was viewed as a strong leader. And in fact, the trauma of September the 11th, 2001, remains a part of the American psyche. Certainly, it has changed politics in this country. It is very clear that midterm in November of 2002, George Bush Jr. was able to win the election, although the economy was in terrible condition, because he drew on what I would call the trauma of September the 11th. He now brought up an issue which became, in his mind, in the minds of many Americans, the dominant issue. Not the economy, but security. We are facing a terrible enemy ever since September the 11th. That enemy is world terrorism, and the center of world terrorism lies in the world of Muslim fundamentalism, and we have to fight them. And we need strong leadership and determined responses. Strong. And I, George Bush Jr., provide that for you. You saw what I did immediately after September the 11th, 2001, so now in November 2002, here I am, defending your security. You may be unemployed, but you are secure. No. But you are secure. And I do want to say that that issue won the election for him. And I do not doubt that, again, that will be a major issue in the campaign, if not the primary issue. Now, of course, his ability to win in November 2002 was based on a victory. Following September the 11th, 2001, a few months later, the U.S. Army, with the approval of the United Nations and supported by other European powers, invaded Afghanistan, and within a matter of 2 months, declared a victory, which indeed was a victory. The Taliban government, which had sheltered Osama bin Laden, was overthrown, and the Allies were victorious. And although some people had been skeptical about the Afghan war, on the whole there was worldwide support for it, and George Bush Jr. in the process had assembled a great alliance. So when the election of November 2002 came up, he had a record as a strong war president and a victory. You can trust me, I get things done. I don't blunder. But now we're in 2004, and in March of 2003, something happened that sort of changed the picture. The U.S. Army, pretty much on its own, with a few allies, but pretty much on its own, and without the support of the United Nations, which made it different from Afghanistan, invaded Iraq. And in fact, it looked like a splendid victory. There seemed to be an initial resistance which was surprising, but in the end, the regime tumbled like a house of cards. And it looked as though George Bush Jr. had chalked up a second victory only to confirm his efficiency as the defender of American security. Another enemy had fallen. But that was a year ago. And our troops are still there. And this morning, if you opened up the newspaper, you may have seen the grisly photograph. 4 non-military workers in Fallujah, which is not far from Baghdad, were killed by an angry mob, and then they were burned, and then their bodies, their charred bodies, were hung from a bridge. It's reminiscent of the photograph that drove the Americans from Somalia back in the early part of the Clinton administration. Well, is that a sign that the President of the United States is in charge? That we're safe? I mean, there are lots of anxieties that we have going into the election. The anxiety about the economy, the anxiety about the moral condition of the United States of America, the anxiety concerning our welfare system, in particular our health care. But certainly one of the primary anxieties we have is, are we now stuck in a war that is reminiscent of what happened in Vietnam in the 1970s? How are we going to get out? What is going to happen? The clear victory that occurred in Afghanistan is not there in Iraq. Now, the war in Iraq provided us with many surprises. Not necessarily pleasant surprises, but unpleasant surprises. The motivation given for the urgency of going into Iraq was the presence in Iraq of dangerous weapons, chemical and biological and perhaps nuclear, that could be used almost immediately by the insane, ruthless ruler of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, against the world. And we had to go in right away, before it was too late and before they were used. So we went in, and it was expected that we might not find all of what was predicted to be there, but we would find some of what was predicted to be there. So far we have found zilch, zero, nothing. I mean, that's a huge letdown. After all, there have been hundreds of American casualties. There have been billions of dollars spent, and it may be the case that Saddam Hussein was indeed a ruthless dictator, and the world is better off with his loss of a job. But the world has a lot of ruthless dictators. If we had to invade every country with a ruthless dictator, we might not be able to afford it or have the time. The major motivation was that this was a ruthless dictator with the power to assault the security of the United States of America. Where's the stuff? Where's the evidence? Then there was the surprise of the people. We were told that they would be overwhelmingly grateful when we came. And indeed, there were scenes where people came out of their homes and so forth, greeted the American troops, and were very grateful to be rid of Saddam Hussein. But now we have discovered, certainly in central Iraq, strong pockets of resistance. And throughout Iraq, except in the Kurdish areas, a very strong anti-Americanism, which basically says, you came for your own purposes, and we're glad you got rid of Saddam Hussein, but now get out. We don't like you. We never liked you. We were told that we would be welcomed, and that maybe out of it would come an ally, that we would have a base of friendship now in the Middle East that didn't exist before. Even among the Shiites who were persecuted by Saddam Hussein, who hated him intensely, and who were grateful for his overthrow, there is an intense dislike of the Americans. Well, that's a surprise. For all that sacrifice, we expected love. Like, hello, so glad you're here. One of the great surprises was how unprepared we were to take over Iraq. There was a period of chaos which could have been anticipated, but which was not. And we were totally unprepared to deal with it. In fact, a lot of the anti-Americanism that exists is the result of our unpreparedness. People expected the Americans. We'd move in, we'd make the electricity work, the grid work, we would bring in food supplies, the whole thing. We would subdue any chaos. Instead, for months, the situation was chaotic. The team that was so good at planning the invasion had no effective plans for managing the follow-up. We took it, and we didn't quite know what to do with it. We were totally caught by surprise. So the efficiency of the invasion and the winning of the war was followed by this embarrassing period of seeming incompetence. One of the great surprises for us was how much the factions in Iraq hate each other. We were told there are Arab Sunnis and Arab Shiites and Kurds and so forth, and they don't like each other, but after all, in the end, they'll cooperate, they'll be glad. Other than the people who worked directly for Saddam Hussein, they'll be glad that we came to remove Saddam Hussein. We talk about democracy. You can't have democracy when indeed the three nations that make up the state can't live together. The Kurds don't like the Arab Sunnis and the Arab Shiites. The Arab Sunnis hate the Kurds and they hate the Arab Shiites. And the Arab Shiites, who are the majority in Iraq, hate the Sunnis, and they don't care about the Kurds. So how you paste this thing together, how much thought was given in Washington when they were planning the war to what they would do after the war? Because that was even more important than winning the war. If you win the war and lose the peace, well, that certainly was a surprise, but the greatest surprise is going on right now. It's Mr. Clark, with an E at the end of his name. Mr. Clark worked for a long time in what we call national security. Mr. Clark goes all the way back through Republican administrations. He worked for Clinton also, and then he became a trusted advisor of the Bush administration. And what he says is very interesting. He says that before September the 11th, not only was there no attention paid to warnings that indeed something terrible was going to happen, but that the administration was totally obsessed with the invasion or with the problem of Iraq, to the point that, that's his accusation, true or not, to the point that George Bush Jr. instructed him, almost, to find some connection between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein and Iraq. Does that mean that the invasion of Iraq was planned before September the 11th? That in fact the war with Iraq preceded any thought of the war with the Taliban in Afghanistan? I mean, if that be true, it's an overwhelming scandal. It would be an issue in the election, if properly dramatized, that could be used as a weapon by the Democrats against the Bush administration. And it's very clear that the Bush administration is fearful because of the intelligence mess-up, in particular with regard to dangerous weapons. Congress now has a committee investigating, and they wanted Condoleezza Rice and the president and the vice president to testify. And the answer that was given was no. There's a separation of powers here, and the executive of the United States of America needs the privilege of privacy. No, Condoleezza is not coming. But now with the revelations of Clark, a second thought now arises. Condoleezza is coming, and she will testify under oath. And the president and his vice president are coming. Interestingly, and it doesn't appear to be a tribute to the president, he will only testify if he testifies together with the vice president. Generally speaking, when you interrogate witnesses, you separate them, do you understand? Because they shouldn't cooperate with their stories. But this means that if the president is unable to answer a question, he can simply turn to Dick. Forgive me for being so informal. He simply can turn to the vice president and say, so what's the answer? And not only that, he can hear the answers of the vice president. They can coordinate their answers. So obviously, the Republican administration is very concerned about this whole thing. And one of the central questions, of course, is going to be, was the war with Iraq on the mind of the administration before September the 11th, 2001? And why? Well, with that, let me now turn to Iraq and the problem of conquering Iraq. In order to understand the problems of the Americans, let me talk about previous conquerors. Because Iraq is one of those countries that has been continuously conquered. It has at least a dozen names throughout its history, from Babylonia to Assyria to Chaldea to Mesopotamia. I mean, do you understand? And all these names are a function of different conquerors who've shown up and taken over and encountered problems of their own, all right? So we certainly are conquerors, right? We conquered Iraq, so maybe we can learn something from the past, all right? I mean, what happened to these other conquerors who showed up in Iraq? The first conquerors of Iraq that we know about, and this goes back somewhere around 3000 to 2500 BC, were the Semites. The Semites were a conglomerate of peoples who lived in Arabia and who ultimately produced people called the Hebrews, the Arameans, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Eastern Semites, who turned into the Babylonians and the Assyrians, showed up, and they conquered Iraq. And Iraq at that time was a developed civilization. The people who lived in Iraq were a people called the Sumerians. And the Semites came and conquered it. And what is interesting about the Semitic thing was they swallowed Sumerian civilization totally and completely. Instead of trying to change the natives, they simply what? Turned into the natives. They settled down in Iraq, and Iraq now had a base Semitic population, but the only thing they really changed was the language. So one of the ways they held on to Iraq was they stayed there. Now, it's highly unlikely that somebody from central Kentucky, do you understand, northern Wisconsin, whatever, I mean, the huge groups of people from the United States of America will move in and stabilize the situation by staying. They're not going to do that. The second group were the Persians. The Persians are now called Iranians. And Iran, as you know, is the enemy of Iraq, or was the enemy of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The Persians don't like the Arabs don't like the Persians, whatever it be. They showed up with a great king called Cyrus. They conquered Iraq. And they wanted to make Iraq, in fact, the center of their empire, which stretched all the way to Egypt. One of the things they did do, which they took from the people in Iraq, was a language. The language of Iraq, at the time the Persians came, was a language that had become the chief commercial language of the Middle East. The name of the language is Aramaic. And here again is a process of where they borrowed. Do you understand? Try to adapt. They made Aramaic, this chief commercial language, the language of the whole empire, not Persian. And so Iraq functioned a little bit like the center of the Persian Empire, but the people were never effectively Persianized, and they rose up in revolt after revolt. The third group of people who came, who gave the name to the land Mesopotamia, which is a Greek word, which means between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were the Greeks. They arrived in the 4th century BC, led by a teenager who I think had turned 20 already. His name, Alexander the Great, and in fact he took all of Iraq and then swept eastward all the way to India. He realized something about Iraq which is very important. It may have been in the idea and mind of the American military. Looking at the Middle East, if you want to call it the Middle East, he saw Iraq as the center. And in fact, Alexander the Great's intention was to put his capital, believe it or not, in Iraq. It was the center. There was empire to the west of it. There was empire to the east of it. He was a Greek. He wasn't going to have his capital in Greece. In fact, he intended to make Babylon his capital. The unfortunate thing that happened was that at the age of 33, he most likely was poisoned in Babylon and died. And that was the end, if you will, of the Greek dream. But what's interesting is that it was viewed by the Greeks as a very strategic, do you understand? As a very strategic place, like a center place. If you wanted to control the area, that would be a very good place to put your base of operations. In fact, the general, or one of the generals who followed Alexander, whose name was Seleucus, actually established two capitals. One capital in Syria, which is called Antioch, which is not Ohio. It started in Syria. Okay. And the second was a capital named after him right near Babylon, called Seleucia, because he saw this as a kind of a central base for controlling the area. Following the Greeks came the Romans. Somewhere around the year 113 AD, the Roman emperor was a man by the name of Trajanus. And in fact, it was under him that the Roman Empire reached its greatest limits. And one of the things he wanted to do, because he felt it strategically was very important for the Romans, he wanted to push the Roman Empire eastward. So he invaded Iraq, which at that time, the Greek word for it was Mesopotamia, and he took it. He marched all the way down to the Persian Gulf. Now, there were people in the Roman Senate that claimed that he had gone too far, that the Roman Empire was getting too big, unable to administer it. But the Romans stayed there for about 30 years. And then under the Emperor Hadrian, who followed the Emperor Trajan, they withdrew partially. They kept northern Iraq, but they gave up southern Iraq, and it remained part of the Roman Empire. They felt that that place, again, was a strategic place for their control of the East. The one thing that did come to Iraq as a result of the Roman occupation is something that Detroit is familiar with. The official religion of the Roman Empire after the 4th century became Christianity. And in fact, the east of the Roman Empire was the most Christian part of the empire. And in fact, Christianity poured over into Iraq, even across the Roman frontier. Christians who were out of favor with the Orthodox or Catholic establishment often fled across the border in Iraq, and that's why we have Iraqi Christians who are called Chaldeans, because Christianity moved into the area, and these Christians were spared the government of the Roman Empire because they were just right across the border. But Rome failed to hold on to it. The people who were most successful were people who came in the 7th century. They came out of Arabia. They were Semites, like the Babylonians and Assyrians, and they managed to hang on to Iraq. They're called the Arabs. When they arrived, Iraq was not Arab. Iraq was a mixture of Semitic peoples. There were some Persians, there were some Greeks, there were some leftover Roman. I mean, the whole, that was it. They came in, and they have been overwhelmingly successful, because if you go to Iraq today, you can see what happened. It's highly unlikely that after our conquest, the Iraqis are going to start speaking English. The Arabs came, and one of their techniques for holding Iraq for them was very important, because their empire was very big, and they saw Iraq as a kind of central place for, is strategic, do you understand? Controlling the area. So many Arabs came and they settled down there. And in fact, over many centuries, the language of the place changed from Aramaic, it changed to Arabic. In addition, they converted the people, most of the people, to the Arab religion, which was a comparatively new religion, which started in Arabia in the 6th and 7th century AD. It's called Islam. Most of the people became Muslims, which reinforced their new Arab identity. But then came a very important choice. The Persians wanted their capital there. The Greeks wanted their capital there. The first Arab capital had been in Medina, where Muhammad had lived just north of Mecca. The second Arab capital was in Damascus, which is in Syria. But in the 8th century, the Arabs moved their capital because they felt it was strategically more significant. It was a better location in terms of controlling both east and west. They moved their capital to Iraq, and they built a city called Baghdad. And Baghdad became one of the largest cities in the world. Certainly in the 8th century, it most likely was the most magnificent city in the world. The Arabs chose Iraq to be the what? The center, the strategic center of their empire. Along the way, they inherited a problem. Many of the people they converted were Christian, but the Christians did not find equality with the Arabs. So that led to a division that was to spread all over Islam. Those who followed the established authority were called Sunnis. And those who most likely came out of the Christian population and felt themselves discriminated against became Shiites. And in fact, there are many things about the Shiite religion or the Shiite branch of Islam that are reminiscent of Christianity. You may recently have seen the film The Passion of the Christ. One of the items of historic Christianity is the importance of martyrdom and suffering as a redemptive experience. Suffering isn't meaningless, suffering is good. So if you go to the two shrines, Shiite shrines in Iraq at Karbala or Najaf, just recently they had their great festival, the Ashura festival. You will see people, they take knives and they cut themselves, they take whips and they whip themselves. That wasn't part of what we call the original Islam. That was an accretion that came as a result of hundreds and thousands of Christian converts coming into the fold. However, the Arab control of Iraq led to a split, which is still one of the major problems, a problem that in fact the Arabs themselves were unable to control. What followed the Arabs came a people called the Mongols. The Mongols were not Muslim and they were not Christian, and they weren't even Buddhist. They had their own religion. Their main religion was war. They invaded in the 13th century. They invaded Iraq. They took Baghdad. And their answer, the way they controlled Iraq for over a century and a half, is very simple. They killed everybody in the city of Baghdad. That's control. Is that control? No, I mean, it's control. They killed everybody. Intimidation. There was no resistance. Do you understand? They destroyed the irrigation system. They wrecked the whole economy. They didn't care. They looted and they pillaged, do you understand? And they maintained control of the place. The economy declined, but they had no resistance. Now, the Mongols were followed in the 16th century by a people who were to stay there until 1918. They're called the Turks. And the Turks made a fateful decision. The Turks were Sunni Muslims. They had conquered a land in which the majority of the people who remained after the Mongols were Shiites. There was a small number of Sunnis and a large number of Shiites. And when the Turks took over Iraq, it was an economic nothing. Almost everything had been destroyed. The irrigation system was not restored. Agriculture faded away. Large parts of Mesopotamia, of Iraq, turned to desert. People returned to being Bedouin after they were farmers. Now, the Turks decided that they would control Iraq by favoring one group over the other. Since both groups hated each other, they had a choice of picking either the Sunni or the Shiites. They chose the Sunni because they were Sunni. And the Sunni were a minority. So if they used Arab police, they only used Sunni Arabs. They never used Shiite Arabs. The whole administration was Sunni. It was very clear that if you were a Shiite, you had no chance of getting any kind of job in the Turkish administration. The economy was rotten anyway. No chance. And in fact, that policy, instituted by the Turks, remained in force until the Americans came in 2003. Although the Shiites were a majority of the nation, a minority of the population, somewhere around 20%, got all the jobs. They were the Sunnis. And in fact, the Sunnis got used to ruling Shiites. And one of the problems we have today in the control of Iraq is, that's where Fallujah, where those bodies were burned. Fallujah is in Sunni territory. These were people who had supported the Turks, and then they would support Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, do you understand? And now they don't have their jobs anymore, and they're angry, and they're mad, and they can't even conceive that some dumpy, no-good Shiite would come in and run their government. It was a fateful decision. The Turks also responded to the Kurds, who were the hillbillies of the area up in the north. They recruited them. They used the Kurds often as auxiliaries in their armies to do dirty work. The Japanese did that. The Japanese recruited Koreans sometimes during World War II to do the dirty work in the concentration camps or whatever they were. I mean, they did the kind of dirty work. And one of the jobs of the Kurds was to go around killing Armenians. They liked to do that. That was a part of it. So they had a job. They were brought into what we call the Turkish world, but the economy was rotten. And then in 1918 and 1919, because of the defeat of the Turks in the First World War, there now arrived the British. The British conquered, took Iraq. The British Army arrived in Iraq. They arrived first in 1917, and they consolidated their control in 1919. And so they were confronted with the same problem, the Americans, right? So now the British arrived. The British initially were not enthusiastic about Iraq. They took it because they felt it would protect their passage to India, but having arrived, something was discovered coincident with their arrival, and that was petroleum. And that persuaded them that remaining was very important. Now, the British made a fateful decision. Very interesting. They built an infrastructure. They brought in Western administration. They brought in Western culture. They tried to create an Arab westernized elite. But they confronted this internal argument in Iraq that wouldn't go away. It goes all the way back to the Arab period. It was the argument between the Sunni and the Shiites, and they had to make a choice. Quite frankly, if I were looking at the statistics, sipping my scotch at the British Club in Baghdad, if I were looking at the statistics, I would have chosen the Shiites. They were the overwhelming majority of the people of Iraq. And in fact, in favoring them, you would have favored the majority, and there would have been some kind of democratic base to your choice. But the British didn't do that. The people they met, the people who were the administrators under the Turks, the upper class, were all Sunni. And you know the British. I mean, these people sort of knew how to behave, and those Shiites were like, not hillbillies, I mean, they were peasants. I mean, what are you going to do with them? So the British made the same choice for controlling Iraq that the Turks made. And that was to use a small minority, got it, of people who would support them, and that would be the Sunni. By so doing, they also alienated the Shiites, and now they were dependent on this minority of people called the Sunni. You can't call it exactly stability. Most of the new intellectuals, most of the westernized people came out of the Sunni. In fact, what the British did was they trained police to assist them. There weren't enough Englishmen to ship to India and everywhere, do you understand, to control the empire. So they needed locals. And the people they recruited for their police were Sunni. They used no Shiites. So in a Shiite area, the British would send Sunni police. If they wanted auxiliaries, which was the beginning of the Iraqi army, they recruited the officers entirely from the Sunni. They might recruit a few privates from the Shiites, but they favored the Sunni. And then, when they had trained the police and trained the army, and as the British Empire is declining in the 1930s, they reap the reward. Instead of gratitude, what they get is a rebellion led by the newly trained Sunni police and army against the British, and the British are forced to grant Iraq independence in the middle of the 1930s, but they hang on to the petroleum and to military bases until 1958. The British are the last of the conquerors before the Americans. In 1934 and 1935, Iraq is granted its independence by the British, triggered by the Sunni revolt. But the British maintain control, basically, over Iraqi foreign policy. They do that until 1958. In 1958, there is a rebellion against the government, which is viewed as too pro-British. The British are the allies of the United States of America. The United States of America is the ally of Israel, and Israel has now entered into Arab politics. And so a rebellion occurs. When I saw the photograph in the newspaper this morning, it reminded me of what happened in 1958. In 1958, the Prime Minister of Iraq, whose name was Nouri es-Said, was captured. And then, by the way, they dragged the 4 bodies through the streets. They tie them to the tails of horses, and or to automobiles, and they just what? They just drag. That's not how you kill somebody. You drag them through the streets. Nouri es-Said, who was the prime minister, was tied to the tail of a horse, and he was dragged through the streets of Baghdad. That's how he was finished. And now Iraq was fully independent, and when it became fully independent, the country, after having had all these conquerors, found itself under extreme tension. So let me mention the tensions that existed. There were 2 political parties that now moved in to take over Iraq with the British gone. One had a connection to the Soviet Union. It's called the Communist Party. It's hard to imagine there was a Communist Party in Iraq, but there was a Communist Party in Iraq, mainly because communism meant anti-Western to these people. They didn't understand Marx so much as they meant anti-Western, and for some people, communist meant progressive, meant the liberation of women. So there was the Communist Party, and the other party that opposed it was the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party, the word Ba'ath means Renaissance Party, had various leaders. One of its leaders was a man called Saddam Hussein. Now, what I want to indicate to you is that after all this time, even with this rebellion, the leaders of both parties were Sunni. Do you understand? The overwhelming majority of the people are Shiites. What had started in the Turkish period just continued. That is, anybody in any position of leadership was a Sunni. Those are the people you worked with. They were in charge, and in fact, the Sunni Ba'ath fought the Sunni communists. There was the tension between the Sunni and the Shiites. There was the tension between the Arabs, who were both Sunni and Shiite, and the Kurds, who lived in the north. And then one of the major tensions they inherited was the tension between the religious and the secular. There's a tension going on right now when they try to draft the Constitution of Iraq. Interestingly enough, the overwhelming majority of the Shiites, because they were very poor, they were very religious. But among the Sunni population, there was a fairly substantial secular sector that wanted to modernize and to westernize Iraq so that it would be strong and powerful. And there was this tension. Which way was Iraq going to go? And then in 1958, there was a choice on how to ally Iraq. We don't want America or Britain anymore, but there are two choices. One choice is the Soviet Union, right? And the Communist Party was certainly in favor of the alliance with the Soviet Union. The other choice was a man in Egypt who was trying to unify the Arab world. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he was a very powerful figure. And there were many people in Iraq who said, no, we don't want to fall under the controls of the Russians. Let's ally ourselves with Nasser. Well, in the end, it was resolved because the Ba'ath Party won and its leader, Saddam Hussein, won. And the choices that came about for the control of Iraq were the following. First, one and only one political party. That'll maintain law and order, won't it? Called the Ba'ath Party. Two, power is in the hands of the Sunni. If there's a general, he's what? Sunni. If there is a head of a department, he's what? Sunni. If there is a chief professor in the university, he's what? Sunni. All important jobs of control and management were given to the Sunni under Saddam Hussein. In the conflict between the Arabs and the Kurds, it was very clear. The Arabs win. And in fact, we know what Saddam Hussein did to the Kurds. It was a way of maintaining law and order. He moved Arabs into the Kurdish area. There is a city in northern Iraq, it's called Kirkuk. It's in the center of the oil area. He simply moved large numbers of Arabs into Kirkuk to change the population so that it wouldn't be majority Kurdish, it would be majority Arab. He moved Arabs into the area, he wanted to Arabize them, and then when the Kurds resisted, he gassed them. He did use, by the way, we know that. I mean, we have evidence that he used chemical weapons against them. But he did do something. He established law and order. Did he not establish law and order? Something that doesn't presently exist. But I mean, he did establish law and order. And when it came to the choice of whom to ally with, Saddam Hussein made a very interesting choice. Although he would receive military assistance and money from the Soviet Union, he refused to ally himself with the Soviet Union. And he would not ally himself with Nasser, who anyway was destroyed in 1967, basically in the war with Israel. His idea was that Iraq, not Egypt, should be the center. Got it? It's the center of the what? The Middle East. It's the center, it's the strategic center of the Middle East. And in fact, Iraq should be the central feature of a united Arab world or a united Muslim world that may be more secularized, whatever it be. He imagined himself as the leader. Well, those are the precedents. That's the history of trying to maintain law and order when the Americans came. All right? So now let's look at why the Americans came. The American relationship to Iraq was ambiguous and ambivalent. On the one hand, the government of Iraq had been wildly anti-British, and they retained their anti-Western orientation by changing their anti-British to anti-American and throw in anti-Israel because that's always attached to America. So there it was, and therefore it was an enemy, and it was a powerful enemy because Saddam Hussein had invested large amounts of money in developing a very strong military. However, the ambivalence arose because next door to Iraq is Iran. And Iran had been the ally of the United States of America, which reinforced the hostility of the United States of America to Iraq because Iraq and Iran were enemies. The Persians and the Arabs didn't like each other. But when in 1979 Iran was taken over by religious fundamentalists under Ayatollah Khomeini, and they attacked the American embassy, and Iran turned from being an ally of the United States of America into an enemy, a fierce enemy, then the United States of America had to reconsider, right? On the principle, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, the United States of America was not unhappy when Saddam Hussein decided to use the Iraqi army to invade Iran in 1980 in order to seize the Iranian oil fields. We're not unhappy. And in fact, a war started that lasted for 8 years between Iraq and Iran. Which side do we help? Well, they're both anti-American, but which one is more dangerous to America? Now, in the State Department and the Defense Department, there was an argument. There was one group that said Iran is worse than Iraq. That group won out from time to time because we did give aid to Iraq. We sent them money in the war against Iran. But then there was another group that proved to be more powerful in the middle of the 1990s. And they said, no. Iraq, with Saddam Hussein and his fierce anti-Americanism, is worse than Iran because, quite frankly, Ayatollah Khomeini will die, and the history of the Persians is that they have been longtime allies of the United States of America. So in the middle of, not the 1990s, in the middle of the 1980s, President Reagan then, following the advice of this faction, helped to create the scandal that we call Irangate. Now, secret military personnel are sent to Iran to see whether some kind of a deal can be made with the Iranians whereby the Americans would help them in their war against Iraq. Do you recall that? It's almost unbelievable. Or to say the least, the policy of the United States toward Iraq was schizophrenic. Do you understand? One day hot, one day cold, you can't call it a well-disciplined policy at all. What ultimately drove us into a policy of wanting to assault and invade Iraq was when Saddam Hussein, having lost the war with Iran, decides to rescue his reputation by invading Kuwait and taking the oil fields, and we obviously could not accept that. And the only reason we could act was because the Soviet Union was falling apart. So that leads to the Gulf War, and in the Gulf War we defeat the Iraqi army, and then comes the question, why didn't we complete the takeover of Iraq? We were there, 1991. Why? Well, were we afraid of offending the Arab world by taking over Iraq? Or was George Bush Sr. and his government afraid of assuming the responsibility of taking over this troubled country? They just knew that what? It would be trouble. So what they hoped for would be that the army in Iraq would overthrow Saddam Hussein, and then another general would what? Take over, maintain the stability. That general would also be Sunni, got it? The stability would be maintained, and Saddam Hussein would be gone, and now we would make a deal with the Iraqis to behave. That didn't happen because Saddam Hussein rallied his forces and ultimately suppressed a rebellion that was led by the Shiites who were counting on the United States of America to show up, and the United States of America didn't show up. Well, that now leads to the big question, which was at the beginning. All right, we didn't take over Iraq, and quite frankly, we were spared the headache of having to administer it, right? We had it penned in by sanctions. No plane could go in, no plane could go out. Why then did Iraq become an obsession for the Republican administration at the beginning of the term in 2001? Isn't that completely right? It was penned in. Question, well, was it because intelligence had revealed, faulty intelligence, that huge stocks of chemical and biological and maybe even nuclear weapons were stored there, and therefore, if we didn't act, given this country's anti-American pose, we would suffer the consequences? Was it because, and that's why things happen in history, was it because George Bush Jr. wished to vindicate his father, George Bush Sr., who had been accused of not completing the war that he had started, although he may have been wise and not try to take over the country? Or was it related to a vision that already existed in the mind of Donald Rumsfeld and the neoconservatives that supported him? He was the Secretary of Defense, and this was before Osama bin Laden brought down the World Trade Center. Was it possible that there was a vision that had been created before September the 11th? Got it? The vision was the following. It had nothing to do with Afghanistan. Afghanistan wasn't even part of the picture. The vision we call the unilateral vision. Many of the people who were part of the Bush team came out of what I would call, it's an intellectual circle actually. The name that is often given to it is the neoconservatives. Their publication is called The Weekly Standard. It is edited by a man called William Crystal. And it existed before Osama bin Laden brought down the World Trade Center. The idea to be found in that group, it's an idea that we call unilateralism, is that the world is filled with many dangers. The Cold War is over, and America is the hegemonic power. And before it's too late, the United States of America must assume responsibility for getting rid of the dangers. She cannot rely on the United Nations because many of the people who are responsible for the dangers have votes in the United Nations, like going to the enemy. Therefore, the United States on its own must remove those dangers, and one of the things that we must do is turn to the area which is now the most provocative area in the world. That area is the Middle East, and we need to establish stability. In order to do that, we need a base in the Middle East. That is our own. Saudi Arabia is too unpredictable, it's too filled with fundamentalists. Egypt is not available to us. The country that is the strategic center, noted also by the Greeks, noted also by the Persians, is Iraq. So what we need to do is not only to remove Saddam Hussein, but to establish an American-friendly government in Iraq where American troops will be welcomed. And therefore we will have a base on the borders of Iran, in the middle of the Arab and the Muslim world, attached to our ally Turkey, which will enable us to clean up the mess. Oh. Does it sound far-fetched? Well, if you read the Weekly Standard, you can pick up some of those ideas, and you could pick up some of those ideas before September the 11th, 2001. So you can pick which reason you think it was. Was it special intelligence reports about the weapons? Was it his father's vindication? Was it unilateralism? Was it a combination of all three, because life isn't simple? All right? So, when September the 11th happened, according to Clark, Bush was obsessed with Iraq. He wanted to, according to Clark, pin the blame on Saddam Hussein. So, did September the 11th simply provide the excuse for going ahead with a plan that was already there? Because why, after Afghanistan was taken, did Iraq become the focus of concern? Was it the center of Muslim fundamentalism? No. Was it allied with Osama bin Laden, no matter how terrible Saddam Hussein was? Most likely not. Osama bin Laden put Saddam Hussein high up on his list of traitors because he was a secularist. I don't know. But the recent revelations make this what? Intriguing. It'll be interesting to see what revelations now come out of the interrogations. But I mean, if it's true or partially true, it is a certain level of outrageousness to it. Well, the American people were mobilized for the war with Iraq with expectations. One, we would discover weapons of terrible destruction when we invaded. Two, we would certainly get our hands on petroleum. Three, there would be people standing in the streets waving, welcome, 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 bringing out little happy birthday cakes, the whole thing. They'd be so glad to see Americans marching into Iraq. Four, we would now have a firm ally in the Middle East that would allow American troops to constitute a base of operations in a strategic center. It's in the strategic center. And not only that, we would be able to create in Iraq, with the cooperation of the Iraqi people, a model for, in quotation marks, democratic government that could be followed by all the other peoples in the Muslim world, if not in the entire Middle East. And the problem, of course, was that almost none of these expectations was fulfilled. If there had been a plan before that even preceded September the 11th, it went awry. And now the question is, what's going to happen and how will it affect the election? And if you'll come back in 5 minutes, I will address. Let me pick up where I left off, because quite frankly, what's been happening over the last week or so has made this whole affair enormously intriguing. And we now have to look at what's going to happen and what the effects on the election might be. Right. Well, the Americans were there. We're in Iraq. We invaded it and we conquered it. Are we lucky? No. That isn't relevant because we're there. Do you understand? When I was born in Women's Hospital in Detroit, was I lucky? I'm there. Do you understand? I'm here. So you have to work with it. So there are all these challenges now. I mean, we're conquerors like the British, do you understand? Like there's a long list of conquerors of Iraq. We're not the first people to invade the place and to conquer it, and conquerors have at least a primary necessity of establishing law and order and meeting some minimal levels of expectation. The only conquerors that chose not to do that were the Mongols. Their message to the people was, open your mouth and you're going to get it. It worked for a short period of time. So what are the challenges? Well, the major challenge is the naivety of the planning. I mean, the people who conceived this plan obviously thought of themselves as very profound planners. They figured out the invasion and the conquest, they just didn't understand maintenance. Like a house, you build it. The main problem isn't building it. It's maintaining it. The second was they inherited all these tensions, which they most likely underestimated, between Sunni and Shiite, Shiite and Sunni and Kurds, and the whole thing. And in fact, they're so terrible that it's hard to discuss democracy, because democracy to the Shiites means we're the majority vote. Isn't that democratic? Democracy to the Sunni and the Kurds means protection of minority rights and overriding the will of the majority in order to protect the minority. Oh, well, two different concepts, right, of democracy. They underestimated the fear of the Sunnis over the possibility of Shiite control. You have to understand. The attitude of the Sunnis toward the Shiites is a little bit like the whites in South Africa toward the blacks. The fear that the blacks were going to take over. I mean, they were the elite. We've been ruling for centuries. Don't you know who we are? We may look alike, but we're certainly not alike. I was once told by somebody in Iraq who was Sunni that he could always tell a Shiite when he saw him, even if he were dressed in Western dress. I got that in Northern Ireland. Some Protestant told me they could always pick out a Catholic, even if they were dressed. They're sitting in a restaurant, they could always, there's something about them. No, it's interesting. You could always pick them out. And then underestimated the bad party, the resentment. They fired all the people who were members of the bad party, who were the main managers. They fired them before they found replacements. Now, the bad people are angry. The reason why they're having all this trouble in Fallujah was one of those towns which had a very high membership in the Ba'ath Party and where most of the men had jobs because of their membership in the Ba'ath Party. And once the Americans arrived, they lost all of their jobs, and they are furious. One of the challenges, obviously, was the chaos that followed. Looters, criminals running through the streets. Since most of the Ba'ath police were members of the Ba'ath Party, they were fired. No police, and now no army. And just American troops who are trained for invasion. They're not trained to do police duty, right? Everybody's running amok. Who knows, there might even be people in this room running around with valuables from the museum. And then there was the problem was the ambivalence of the people. The people had been indoctrinated for years in anti-Americanism, so that even though the rescuers were American, do you understand, it was hard for them to separate their historic hatred from whatever gratitude there might be. And when they saw all the chaos, they weren't sure that welcoming the Americans was good, because what if the Americans fail? And the old people come back? They better not show too much enthusiasm. Saddam Hussein was a charismatic leader. Very interesting. In the Soviet Union today, there are millions and millions of Russians who are nostalgic for Stalin. Because he was what? A strong leader. Do you understand? And what they want is a strong leader. Sometimes a strong leader makes mistakes, but he is a what? A strong leader. And now there's nobody. I mean, they bring in this Shiite millionaire, whatever he is, Shalabi from America, whatever. He ends up at cocktail parties. I mean, when he gets up to speak, a wimp, and they prop him up. They don't have anybody appropriate to provide any kind of leadership. In fact, they don't want that right away, because they don't want anybody Iraqi who might compete with the American authorities. And then the other challenge is your troops are insufficient. You have enough troops to invade and take, but you don't have enough troops to police, and you haven't even trained them. And you can't bring more troops because the American public is not prepared to having you send more troops to Iraq. Now, through all this mess, the Americans have achievements, and they have to be recognized. They reestablished most of the infrastructure. That is, in most parts of Iraq, the electric grid is working. Do you understand? Not perfectly, but it's working. Trucks are moving down the roads. Schools have been reopened. Government offices have been reopened. Markets are functioning. I mean, that's what's happening. We don't get news about it in the newspaper because it's not interesting. It's not interesting to have a front page article that says, all the markets near Basra are open. I bought a newspaper to read that all the markets near Basra are open. What's interesting is, American soldier killed near Basra. That's what? That's news. So we don't get news about the infrastructure. To some degree has been put in place. There are consumer goods. And in fact, there are more consumer goods now than there were under Saddam Hussein. Because under Saddam Hussein, there were the sanctions. You couldn't import anything. Now imported goods are pouring into Iraq. So if you have the money, the consumer goods are available for you to acquire. They're far more numerous than before. There are police. Sometimes reluctant police, because the police are the objects of terrorist attack. But some people are sufficiently desperate for a job that they'll risk it. And now an Iraqi police force is being put in place. Is it big enough to do all the policing? No. But is it better than none? The answer is yes. Oil production, is it back to where it was in the heyday? The answer is no. Are oil pipelines being blown up? The answer is yes. Is oil being shipped out? The answer is, I mean, the beginning of it is there. Is there an administration, a managerial class? One of the resentments now in Iraq is they fired all the bad people, and then they realized they didn't have any other manager, so they had to bring some of them back. It's like in Germany. So you bring back a few Nazis to do management because you don't have anybody. It's controversial, but then at least you bring a few back and people get annoyed and whatever else it is, but you put the administration back in order. They were able to finally get a constitution written which granted minority rights of some kind. It was fashioned. We thought the thing was going to be signed, and then the Shiites wouldn't sign, and then they came back again and they signed. The most interesting achievement, which has to be acknowledged, it was one of, if you think of a unilateral plan that existed before September the 11th, which was facilitated by September the 11th, one of the ideas of establishing the American base in the Middle East was to demoralize the opposition. The Americans are there, they're in the center, do you understand? They've won. Well, one of the rulers, terrible rulers in the Arab world, who taunted the Americans, his name was Muammar Gaddafi. Do you remember him? Brought down airplanes flying over Scotland, Lockerbie. Once the American occupation of Iraq was final, he seemed to see the handwriting on the wall. And he said, instead of fighting the Americans, maybe the thing to do is to join them. Hello, 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 hello. And now everybody, Tony Blair, they're all flying to Libya. Kiss, 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 kiss. Gaddafi is now what, a hero. He wants to enter the Western world, consumer goods, the whole thing. He's not going to cause any more trouble. Who could believe it? Well, that's the direct result of the what? The taking of Iraq. So one can't go around and say nothing positive took place. That's not true. But there are problems, major problems. The Shiites don't like the Constitution. They're somewhere around 65% of the population. Their leaders are primarily religious leaders because they were never allowed to develop a secular elite of sufficient size. That was the Sunni group. And they're saying, we're in favor of democracy. One person, one vote. Isn't that fair? And we happen to be 65% of the people, and we're going to win the election. And finally, after all these years of persecution, do you understand? We're going to be in charge. The only Arab country in which the Shiites are clearly a majority is Iraq. Well, that's very provocative because the Kurds say, you create a purely Shiite government around here, and we're what? We're exiting. And the Sunnis say, you're going to put those Shiites over us with no protection of minority rights, the kind we want, the whole thing. We want a guaranteed slice of the parliament, or we're going to resist. Well, then there's the whole problem of Iran. Iran is a Shiite country. What if Iraq goes Shiite? Iran is run by the Shiite clergy, and now the people who run the Shiites in Iraq are the what? The Shiite clergy. Shiite clergy on one side, Shiite clergy on the other. Oh, kiss, kiss, kiss. What did we do? The next problem, obviously, are the Sunnis, like the ones in Fallujah. They're afraid they're losing their power. What democracy means that the Sunnis who ran this country for centuries aren't going to be able to do it. And they don't want to give up their power, and they don't want to fall under the vengeance of the people they had persecuted before. One of the problems is that the United States of America would certainly like to, because of the cost of the war and the bad publicity of casualties, would like to do something the unilateralists vowed they would never do. They would now like to turn the whole mess over to the United Nations. But the United Nations has said, we're not so sure we want the mess. And two, if we take it over, we want absolute control of it. Oh. Spoil sport, party poopers. And then what's so interesting, of course, is that so many of the people in Iraq looking for leaders, the old secular leaders have been discredited. So the leaders they're now turning to are fundamentalists. Have we created this new Iraq only to see it turned over to fundamentalist clergy? Is that a victory? At least Saddam Hussein was a secularist, committed in some way to some level of Western values. And the last problem is we can't just pull out. Our prestige would be overwhelmingly damaged, and we have some sense of moral obligation, hopefully, to the people we went to rescue. We're just going to walk out and let the Fallujah terrorists take over? Now, that's all aggravated by the fact that Afghanistan is becoming increasingly more expensive. Karzai just asked for about $28 billion, that's all, which he said would help rescue his country. Would rescue a lot of countries, didn't it? And, of course, he's not asking only from the United States of America, but the world as a whole. And quite frankly, we can't afford to see Afghanistan fall back into the hands of the fundamentalists and the Taliban. The second thing is this new investigation where Richard Clarke appeared. I mean, that's troubling. I mean, is it true that the Iraq war was somehow planned even before September the 11th? Will that come out? And it's aggravated, certainly for the government, by the vulnerability of the Republican Party in this election year. So what are the realities that we confront? The first is that the control of Iraq by the Americans right now is good enough so that the Americans can't be driven out. But it's not good enough to create stability. Okay? And it is highly unlikely that we can send more troops, in particular in an election year. We're going to lose the Spanish contingent because the bombing in Spain, instead of strengthening the position of the people in Spain who had supported Bush, undermined it. And in fact, the Spanish Prime Minister Aznar has been replaced by Zapatero, who's a socialist, who says he's going to pull out the whole Spanish contingent from Iraq. It's not a huge one, it's 1,500, but it's there. Reality. We're now developing reluctant allies. Tony Blair, who is our ally, is the Prime Minister of a country which overwhelmingly does not support the war in Iraq. And Aznar was the Prime Minister of a country which overwhelmingly does not support the war in Iraq. So certainly that is problematic. I mean, we need a few allies. The third, obviously, is the continuous vulnerability of our troops attached to public opinion. Every time an American soldier gets killed or an American worker gets killed in Iraq, it makes the front page of the newspaper. So in the end, you might say, well, if you look at the overall casualties in other wars, a few hundred is not that what? That much. But when you're looking at television and front page newspaper, and that's the news from Iraq, you don't get the other news from Iraq, that's what you get. And public opinion is overwhelmingly important, in particular in an election year, then that makes the Republicans very vulnerable and cautious. So one of the realities is this whole issue is an opportunity for Democrats. There's no doubt about it. The Iraq issue is an opportunity for Democrats. If they wish to remove Bush from the presidency, this is one of the issues which they can use because, after all, His claim to authority lies primarily on the issue of foreign policy and national security. But the Democrats have to manage it well. It's a minefield to walk through because you're dealing with all levels of patriotism. On the one hand, people might be willing to accept the fact that huge mistakes were made. On the other hand, they don't want to be told that the casualties died in vain. They're also dealing with the fact that the Democratic candidate, Mr. Kerry, voted for the Iraq War. He could say, I was misinformed. But he's supposed to have what? He's going to be president. He's supposed to have better, better judgment. I mean, so I voted yes for the war, and he's going to have to deal with that. So how do you go through the minefield? Look, if I were a real expert, I wouldn't be here. I would be hired by the political clients. But I'm going to walk out, into it with a few suggestions. All right. The first is that we can't pull out. I mean, Kerry's already said that. We're there. We have an obligation to the people we supposedly liberated. Saddam Hussein was a terrible tyrant. It may be the case that he didn't need to be removed right then and there, but he's gone, and we have some kind of obligation, and we can't simply say peevishly, we're pulling out. Bye-bye. You're on your own. The second is to say we should have consulted the United Nations in the beginning, and we should turn this thing over to the United Nations, and we will yield the authority to the United Nations, and we will cooperate. We will offer financial support to whatever UN effort there is in Iraq, and in fact the UN effort would offer legitimacy to the campaign that doesn't presently exist in the eyes of much of the world. The next thing is, if the United Nations is involved, it will be possible to turn to many of the European powers that were reluctant to participate and to ask them for their help, because the European powers do not wish to see Iraq fall into the hands of fundamentalists or into the hands of chaos. And that would be a way to reassemble the alliance. But at the same time, one has to say, in order to be careful, that the men who died, or the men and women who died in Iraq did not die in vain. Actually, this is an opportunity, not for America alone to do, but for the world, to establish something better than the regime of Saddam Hussein. But above all, and this is what needs to come from Kerry, and whether he's capable of doing it, I don't know. I don't know him very well. Is to state a new vision. The unilateral vision is bankrupt. If indeed it was the foundation of the invasion of Iraq, and if indeed it existed before Osama bin Laden brought down the World Trade Center, it's bankrupt. And therefore, you have to articulate a new vision. A vision of the United States of America as the leading power of the world, organizing alliances, working through the United Nations, right? And responding to the terrorism that undermines law and order on our planet. All right? So, got to be articulated. And you need somebody to do it dramatically, because it has to be heard as an alternative vision, and it has to be tied into what we call appropriate American idealism and American patriotism. Oh. That's all the Democrats have to do. It isn't enough that Bush may be embarrassed, I assure you. Other work needs to be done. But I do wish to say that the recent revelations have provided an opportunity to the Democratic Party to carry on a very effective assault on the Republican administration. The Republicans now are very, very vulnerable. And the very fact that Bush and Cheney have consented to go to testify before the investigation committee is a tribute to running more scared than before. That's not good. You need more self-confidence in order to pull yourself through the election. But it's not guaranteed for the Democrats. It has to be done skillfully, and an alternative vision needs to be articulated, and that vision needs to be tied in some way to American patriotism. Kerry certainly has the power to do that because he has all the patriotic credentials you need, right? He's this bemedaled war veteran from Vietnam. So I don't know what will happen, but I assure you this issue is going to be a big issue. My only concern for the Democratic candidate is that there is a man with a large ego who seems to have the support of somewhere around 5% of the electorate. His name is Ralph Nader, and he's going to make, this is going to be, I want to tell you, this is going to be his primary issue, and that is dangerous for the Democrats because we know that in the last election, in many cases, the difference between the Republican and Democratic votes was not that great. So I hope he will reconsider. I do not think that he will reconsider, and in fact, he may not have as much influence as he had before. All I know is there's an opportunity now for the Democrats that didn't exist before, and I can't wait to see what is going to happen. So thank you all for coming.